It's week 12 of the fantasy football season, and we're not even going to have Jamar Chase, the number one overall wide receiver, here this week. With 6 teams on bye, we're going to be filling some holes at the wide receiver position. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone is doing well out there today, where yes, we have 6 teams on bye. We're missing a ton of studs in our fantasy lineups at the most inopportune moment here in week 12. Now, luckily the wide receiver position is pretty deep, but there is a pretty steep drop-off at some point within the rankings. So that's why in today's show, we're breaking down the top 36 wide receivers for week 12 fantasy football. Now, before we dive into the rankings, let's go ahead and look at some of my bigger hits and misses from just last week. And when we bring up the hits and misses, we got the likes of Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jacoby Myers, and Tyreek Hill. Now for ARSB, I had him as the wide receiver 2 coming into the week. He finished as the wide receiver 1. Jacoby Myers, I didn't even rank him inside my top 36 last week, and a lot of people wanted to leave comments on the video talking about how I forgot about their favorite player, Jacoby Myers. No, I really didn't. He didn't even finish inside the top 36. And then we had Tyreek Hill. I knew he needed to be dropped down the rankings some, but not so much that it was just stupid. I ranked him as the wide receiver 18. He finished as the wide receiver 14. But I did have some big time misses as well. Guys like Ladd McConkey, Terry McLaurin, and Cedric Tillman. Now, Ladd McConkey really benefited from Cincinnati pulling off that crazy comeback and forcing Justin Herbert to have to throw the ball all 4 quarters. Also missed on Terry McLaurin, had him ranked way too high. What was I thinking? I mean, he was a top 5 fantasy wide receiver coming into the game, going up against an opponent in which they were going to have to throw the ball, yet they couldn't get the ball to Terry McLaurin, had him ranked way too high, alongside Cedric Tillman. All the production I expected to go the way of Cedric Tillman actually went the way of Jerry Jeudy, but now week 11 is over. We're moving on to week 12. Let's bring up tier 1 for the wide receiver position. Now, when we do that, we see the likes of Amon-Ra St. Brown, A.J. Brown, Justin Jefferson, Puka Nacua, Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp, and Nico Collins. For Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's going up against the Indianapolis Colts, and he's killing it here as of late. Touchdowns in 8 straight ball games, just went over 10 catches for the second time this year, and with Detroit putting up almost 40 points on the regular and Jamar Chase on a bye week, it just makes sense for me to put Amon-Ra St. Brown here at the top of the list, being that the Indianapolis Colts allow the 14th most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. Then we have A.J. Brown going up against the Rams, another stud wide receiver that has just not been able to find the end zone here as of late. 4 straight games without a touchdown. Now, Devontae Smith is questionable with a hamstring injury, so that could lead to more volume going the way of A.J. Brown in a matchup going up against the Rams, who allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. Then we got Justin Jefferson going up against Chicago. And is it too much to ask for Jettas to get a touchdown at some point here? Please. Only 1 touchdown over the last 6 games is not going to cut it. Now, this isn't going to be the easiest game for him this week, though, going up against Chicago, who allows the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Then we go down to Puka Nacua going up against Philly, and he's locked inside tier 1 with his production since returning. 9+ targets and 7+ catches in 3 of his 4 games since coming back from injury. Now, they're going to need him this week going up against Philadelphia because they allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but they're also extremely difficult to run on. Now, we did see Philadelphia shut down that Washington offense last week. Could they do it again this week against the Rams? Potentially, but give me Matthew Stafford, Cooper Kupp, and Puka Nacua over everything in Washington here thus far. How about Tyreek Hill next going up against New England? And he may not be 100% healthy, but we know the Dolphins are in must-win territory. He just had his best game of the season since week 1, and now a matchup going up against New England, who allows the 11th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Then we move down to Cooper Kupp going up against Philadelphia, and he may not be the big play guy that Puka is, but the volume that he sees there weekly keeps him as a top 12 option. He's had at least 11.5 fantasy points in every game since returning from injury, and in this matchup going up against Philadelphia, like we mentioned before, they allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Then we round out tier 1 with Nico Collins going up against Tennessee, and he looked pretty good in his return, but they're going to work him back in a little bit slowly. He only played in 47% of the snaps in his very first game, but we expect that number to climb each and every week. Now a matchup going up against Tennessee, not the easiest. They allow the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but we know that C.J. Stroud is looking the way of Nico Collins quite often. But before we dive into tier 2, let me shout out today's sponsor, SeatGeek. The holiday season is upon us. Thanksgiving's right around the corner. Christmas will be here before you know it. And right now, there are over 70,000 events on SeatGeek. It's concerts, it's sporting events, it's festivals, and so much more. With over 28 million downloads, SeatGeek right now is the #1 rated ticketing app. They put all the tickets from across the web into one place, so you know that you're going to get a good deal. Each ticket is rated on a scale of 1 to 10. So look for the green dots, because green means good, red means bad. But you know I wouldn't be talking about it if I wasn't going to give you a great discount as well. If you head over to SeatGeek and use our promo code Headliners at checkout, you're going to get $20 off. That's right, $20 off your first purchase with promo code Headliners. Be sure to click the link in the description or check the pinned comment for more information. But all right, now let's dive back into Tier 2. And Tier 2 is where we're going to have DK Metcalf, Mike Evans, CeeDee Lamb, Zay Flowers, Malik Neighbors, Courtland Sutton, and Terry McLaurin. Now for DK Metcalf, he's going up against Arizona. He came back off his knee injury last week and immediately played in 90% of the snaps. But here's a crazy stat. He's never had more than 58 yards receiving against the Arizona Cardinals in his career. Now, Arizona does allow over 26 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and Tyler Lockett's a little bit banged up, so I got DK Metcalf right here in Tier 2. Then we got Mike Evans going up against the Giants, and at the time of this recording, he is still questionable to play. And if he does play, we could see a slightly lower snap count here in his first few games back, but we know that Mike needs to get hot if he wants to have a chance at continuing his 1,000-yard streak. In a matchup going up against the Giants, they allow just under 26 fantasy points per game. But we all know that Mike Evans only needs a couple of catches or touchdown opportunities to give us a great fantasy day. Then we got CeeDee Lamb going up against Washington. I think we know by now that CeeDee's still going to get his volume with Cooper Rush at quarterback, and he's going to get some decent yardage as well. But this offense isn't going to be good enough to score touchdowns a lot. Now a matchup going up against Washington. They allow right around the league average of 26 fantasy points per game, so CeeDee Lamb sitting right here, mid-tier 2. Then we got Zay Flowers going up against the Chargers. He was saved by a touchdown last week, but his volume has also been a little bit lower here as of late. 6 targets a game isn't bad, but it's going to keep his ceiling a lot lower. Now a matchup going up against the Chargers, who are easier to run on than throw on, so he should have some chances here in Week 12. Got him mid-tier 2 as well. Then we move down to Malik Neighbors going up against Tampa Bay, and this is a great matchup coming off the bye. Tampa Bay allows the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but now we have to rely on Tommy DeVito. He's not really a high-volume passer, so we're going to have to really rely on touchdowns here. The problem with that, Malik Neighbors doesn't have a touchdown since Week 3, but just due to the matchup and the volume he could see, I had to put him up inside the top 12, even though it's at number 12. At 13, we see Courtland Sutton going up against Las Vegas, and he continues to be a locked-in wide receiver 2 at worst. Over his last 7 games, Sutton has had at least 70 yards or a touchdown in 6 of 7 of them. Now a matchup going up against the Raiders, they allow the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, so this isn't some easy matchup. With the way that Bo Nix is playing, I got Courtland Sutton here low tier 2, alongside Terry McLaurin going up against Dallas. And last week absolutely sucked. A horrible time for his worst game of the season. Jaden Daniels just could not get him the football. But this is a little bit better matchup for him here this week going up against Dallas. They allow right around the league average as well of 26 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. All right, now down to Tier 3. And in Tier 3, this is where we got George Pickens, Ladd McConkey, Deebo Samuel, Juwan Jennings, DeAndre Hopkins, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Marvin Harrison Jr., Jaden Reed, Calvin Ridley, and Jamison Williams. Now for George Pickens, he's going up against Cleveland, and expectations were a lot higher for him in Week 11, but he still had a solid overall game. He's had at least 12 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 contests, and now has a matchup going up against Cleveland, who allows the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. So Jake, why is George Pickens so low? Well, the weather is not going to be great in this game. In fact, it's going to be horrible. There's going to be wind, there's going to be rain, there could even be snow, and it's going to be pretty dang cold. Because of all that, it adds a lot of risk, and I had to drop him down a few spots. Then we got Ladd McConkey going up against Baltimore, and he really benefited last week from Cincinnati making that huge comeback against the Chargers. He's really turning into a chunk play wide receiver as well. He's averaging over 18 yards per reception in 3 of his last 4 games played. That really helps when you do have inconsistent targets like he does. But this one is a great matchup going up against Baltimore. They allow the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Then we got Deebo Samuel going up against Green Bay, and he just hasn't been able to have a good ceiling game over the last month or so of the season. Also sounds like George Kittle is going to be back, and CMC is close to 100%. That means Deebo Samuel is back to his boom or bust production. Now a matchup going up against Green Bay, they allow the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. After him, got his teammate, Juwan Jennings. And as of right now, he's the safest wide receiver in San Francisco. Back-to-back
back-to-back games with 11 targets and at least 90 yards. Now, touchdowns, they're not going to come weekly, but with the volume he's seen, he is a great flex option at worst. Now, after him, we got DeAndre Hopkins going up against Carolina, and we just saw D-Hop play his lowest snap percentage in a game since joining the Chiefs. But obviously, this is going to be a much better matchup this week. The issue that I could see, does Kansas City get a lead late and really run more second half of the ball game? Carolina is much easier to run on than throw on, but D-Hop in a Mahomes-led offense always has that touchdown upside. Then we have JSN, Jackson Smith, and Jigba going up against Arizona. It was a great sign to see him come off the bye last week and once again get double-digit targets. He now has back-to-back games with over 115 yards, and Arizona allows 26 fantasy points per game. Now, because of that and the fact that Tyler Lockett's currently questionable, JSN remains the binky this week for Geno Smith. Then we go down to his opponent in that game, Marvin Harrison Jr. He's coming off the bye week as well. And do the Cardinals actually use him right now? Because listen to this. Marv has had less than 60 yards receiving in 7 of his 10 games this season. WTF, a great opportunity for him to bounce back and really get going second half of the season here in this matchup. Seattle allows the 12th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Then we go down to Jaden Reed going up against San Francisco. And as much as I hate to admit it, Jaden Reed may have lost his weekly safety. The volume is just too inconsistent. 3 of his last 4 games have been under 5 targets, and now matchup going up against San Francisco, who allows the 12th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We're going to need big-time plays from Jaden Reed to be fantasy viable down the stretch. Now, after him is where we go down to Calvin Ridley going up against Houston. With the run game in Tennessee currently banged up, and with it being easier to throw on Houston than run on them, Tennessee is going to have to use Calvin Ridley this week if they want to have a chance. Houston allows the 9th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, and even if Houston were to get a big lead early, that's only going to help Calvin Ridley because it's going to force him to throw for all 4 quarters. Then we round out tier 3 with Jameson Williams going up against Indianapolis, and we just saw JMO get the most targets in a game that he's had since week 2 just last week. This Detroit offense is just absolutely killing people as of late. Now, Indianapolis, they allow over 26 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but they are a dangerous team right now because they are in must-win situations. But just because we saw some decent volume last week, don't let it fool you. We are still going to need a big play in order for Jameson Williams to remain fantasy startable. Which then leaves us tier 4. It's Devontae Smith, Josh Downs, Tank Dell, Jacoby Myers, Cedric Tillman, and Quentin Johnston. Now for Devontae Smith, he's going up against the Rams. Now he's currently questionable with a hamstring injury, so he is definitely somebody we need to pay attention to, but he only has 43 total yards over his last 2 games combined. Now the Rams allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but if Devontae Smith isn't 100% healthy, there's going to be a lot of risk here. Then we go down to Josh Downs going up against Detroit, and with the way that Detroit is just beating the brakes off of people here as of late, you have to think the Colts will have to throw the ball for all 4 quarters. Detroit allows the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers because their opponents are always playing catch up. Then we go down to Tank Dell going up against Tennessee, and with Nico getting more snaps weekly, we're going to start seeing a little bit more hit or miss Tank Dell. Now this Houston offense still needs to figure it out. They still need to get going. They're not firing on all cylinders. Now in a matchup going up against Tennessee though, who does allow the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, you have to think that Tank is a little bit more big play dependent. Then we have Jacoby Myers going up against Denver, and this guy has more truthers than I truly expected. I didn't include him in last week's rankings and people flipped the F out. Then the dude went out and had only 48 total yards. Now he gets a matchup going up against Denver, who allows the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. So with all that being said, why is he even this high in my rankings this week? Well, really for 2 reasons. One is because we have 6 teams on a bye. Secondly, they did play Denver a few weeks ago. Jacoby Myers in that game had 6 catches for 72 yards. Thought he could be a low-end flex play for you this week. Then we got Cedric Tillman going up against Pittsburgh. He had a disappointing week last week, but the volume was still there. He's had at least 8 targets now in 4 straight games, but the weather, like we mentioned, is not going to be great in this game. Then you take into account that they're going up against Pittsburgh, who already allows the 8th fewest fantasy points per contest, had to drop Cedric Tillman down a lot here this week. Then we got Quentin Johnston going up against Baltimore. And last week he was only able to bring in 2 of his 8 targets, but was able to find the end zone again. Now has touchdowns in 3 straight games, and Justin Herbert right now is absolutely dealing. In a matchup going up against Baltimore, they allow the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. All right, on to tier 5. And this is where we have the likes of Wan'Dale Robinson, DJ Moore, Jerry Jeudy, Jalen Waddle, Rome Odunze, and Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. Now for Wan'Dale Robinson, he's going up against Tampa Bay, and at least he's played with Tommy DeVito before, and the matchup like this going up against Tampa Bay, he could easily rack up 8 catches for like 50 yards. Then we have DJ Moore going up against Minnesota, and he just had the most touches in a game that he's had since week 3. Now, he still hasn't had over 70 yards in a game in the last 5 weeks, and it doesn't really help that Caleb Williams has no touchdowns over the last month of the season. But it is a good matchup going up against Minnesota, who allows the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Then we have Jerry Jeudy going up against Pittsburgh. The most worrisome part here, like we've talked about numerous times in this show, is the weather. Rain, snow, and wind, and a quarterback with small hands who's never played in sub 40 degree weather in Jameis Winston against a team who already allows the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers. That's why Jerry Jeudy's down inside tier 5. Then we got Jalen Waddle going up against New England. Just really hasn't done anything since week 1. The big play potential is always there, but he hasn't had over 60 yards in a game since week 1. But this isn't a bad matchup going up against New England, who does allow the 11th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. He's going to remain a boom or bust play. Then we got Rome Odunze going up against Minnesota. He just had 10 targets for the first time in a game since week 3. No pass catcher in Chicago is going to be safe, though. We've talked about this for numerous weeks, but with all the bye weeks, we got to try to chase guys who have volume in good matchups. A good matchup like this one, because like I just mentioned, Minnesota allows the 3rd most fantasy points per game, and then we round out the top 36 with Nick Westbrook-Akine of the Tennessee Titans going up against Houston. Now, he's had a touchdown in 5 of his last 6 games and just had his first 100-yard game of the season in a matchup going up against Houston, who allows the 9th most fantasy points per contest. You have to think that they're playing from behind in Tennessee, and Nick Westbrook is going to have another opportunity at another touchdown.
So there you have my quick and dirty top 36 wide receivers for week 12 fantasy football. Now, hopefully some of these lower tier guys can help carry us for a week or two. It's going to be a rough stretch here the next couple weeks with Thanksgiving next week. We got to make a run to the fantasy playoffs. It's not going to be easy, but this is what we're built for. So if you enjoyed today's show, do me a favor, hit the like button if you haven't already. Now I'm going to go ahead and get out for the day. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same.